Dr. Becky Bowling. She's an assistant professor and extension urban water specialist based out of the AgriLife Center in Dallas. And so she's going to talk to us about some lawn care basics and ways that we can maintain a healthy lawn without using and wasting water. So with that, Becky, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Blake. Let me get all set up here. Okay, well, thank you to those of you that are joining tonight. I'm really excited to be here and be able to speak to you guys. I actually grew up in Denton County, and so has a little special place in my heart. So I'm going to cover a lot of different aspects of lawn care basics tonight, and I'll try to leave some time toward the end if you guys have questions to make sure that I can get to some of those as well. So I am going to kind of reiterate some of the things that Blake talked about. And I'm going to start by talking about our great migration here to Texas that we're seeing, particularly to North Texas. We have a lot of people that are moving here to the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Some of you guys may be recent transplants. Welcome. Texas is a wonderful place to be, as you can see from this quote from Davy Crockett from many years ago. There have long been a lot of folks that would prefer to be here. So, but with that, we do see some potential challenges that Blake has already alluded to. So this is from the Texas Water Development Board State Plan, their 2022. Hey. Oh yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, but we just see, we don't see your slides full screen.
Oh,
we
weird.
Just see the.
Okay, hold on. Let me see. Let me try something here. I may have to. All right, let me try this. Better?
Perfect.
Okay, awesome. So we do expect that there's going to be a lot of population growth over the next 50 years or so. So as you can see from the water plan, they're anticipating that a lot of the growth we've seen in recent decades, if you've been here in the Metroplex for a long time, you've seen a lot of those changes, and we're expecting to see that continue to grow. And this is kind of interesting. This came from the US Census just a couple of years ago. They put together a list of the 15 fastest growing cities in the country. And so of those 15, 7 of those were here in the state of Texas. So that's, almost half of the fastest growing cities in the country are here in the state, including several that are up here in North Texas, like Frisco, McKinney. And so we definitely are seeing a lot of people moving here. And that brings with it some water supply and water demand challenges. So this is also from that state water plan. And if you look over here, the starting point is the year 2020. And when we get to the end of where these lines are, that's going to be about 2050. So as you can see over the next 2070. So as you can see over the next 50 years or so, we're going to see a continued increase in demand on our water supplies. And at the same time, we're going to see a decrease on our existing supply. So those two lines are going to get further and further apart. And it's going to put us in a challenging situation where if we experience a drought, similar to what we experienced in 2011, if you were here for that drought then, we are not going to have enough water in the state to support the population and the demand that we may see. And as Blake indicated, we'll see a lot of this water, municipal water supply being spent outdoors on lawns and landscape areas. So on average throughout the year, we see that about 31% of our potable water supply goes towards landscapes and gardens. And as Blake indicated, in those summer months when things get really hot and people are really trying to keep those plants alive, we see this go up to as high as 60 or 70%. So it accounts for a really significant portion of our potable water use. And unfortunately, as much as 50% of that may never be taken up by plants. And that can be for a variety of reasons, several of which can be rooted into how we irrigate and how we set up our landscape. So we may see, for example, that we're watering more of our sidewalk and our driveway than we are plants. We may see that we're watering at a time of day that's not very effective. We may see that we're watering in a manner that results in a lot of runoff or in a lot of evaporative losses based on the time of day again, or the type of irrigation system that we're using. So there are a lot of things that can potentially go wrong when it comes to our irrigation and our outdoor water use. And so we're going to talk about some ways in which we can try to improve upon that and do some best practices to conserve water in the landscape. I also do like to talk about this other picture, which is sort of this issue of protecting the quality of our water supply. All of this is going to be very tied together. And you may or may not have known it, but everybody lives in a watershed. So after we leave this meeting tonight, you may go and try to figure out, what watershed do I live in? We have several across the state of Texas. A watershed can be small, spanning a single lake or county, or it may span thousands of miles. So the largest watershed that we see here in the United States is going to be the Mississippi River watershed. And when we think about what a watershed is, we're going to see that it's this network of continuous water channels and flows where that water is all going to run across that landscape and feed into a primary source. And as it moves across that landscape, we can see that it can pick up a number of different pollutants that can compromise or contaminate these water sources, whether it's a creek or a lake or a stream. And so as much as possible, we want to try to reduce the types of pollutants that may come off of our landscapes. There's a really interesting book that came out some years ago now, and if you're a really big lawn enthusiast and you're really interested in this topic, it's a book called Lawn People by Paul Robbins, and it's all about sort of the strange way that we think about our lawns. And very often we tend to think about our lawn as being completely separate from anything else around it. So whatever we do on the lawn has no impact on anything else. And we also see in this book, one thing that Paul Robbins observed is that people that are very environmentally conscious and do a lot of good environmental practices in the rest of their life sometimes make exceptions when it comes to their lawns. And there's a lot of really interesting psychology and cultural history behind this, including a lot of the peer pressure or social pressure that we feel in terms of how our lawn looks, what that says about us. We have many communities up here in North Texas that have an HOA. That also puts a lot of pressure on us. And so we have to kind of find that balance. But we do see that there are a lot of pollutants that can come off of our lawns that can be problematic. And actually, when we improve our watering practices and we improve our overall management practices, not only can we conserve water, but we can reduce some of these potential pollutants, which include things like fertilizers and nutrients, bacteria, which may come from pet poop or other animal visitors that visit our yard, pesticides in all forms, and then another common pollutant, of course, would be carbon emissions from our lawn care equipment. And so I'm telling you all of this so that you know landscape decisions matter. And even if you have a relatively small lawn, a relatively small property, you have the power to make a significant impact on our North Texas watersheds, on our North Texas water resources. And so I really want to empower you tonight to think about what are some small things that you can do that are going to not only help you have a beautiful and healthy lawn, but are going to help to conserve and protect that water that's so important for us here in Texas. And so there's several different things we'll talk about tonight. We'll talk a little bit about turfgrass selection. I'm going to introduce several of our more common turfgrass species that we see up here in North Texas and talk a little bit about those. I'm going to talk about irrigation and watering practices. I'm going to talk a little bit about nutrient management, and I'm even going to talk at the end a little bit about pest management and some common pests that we may come across in the summertime. One thing I wanted to share, just some additional statistics. So we already talked about water use. Another thing that we see, for years, we saw that big agriculture, rural agricultural farms were responsible for a lot of the fertilizer pollution that we saw in our water bodies. And increasingly over the last couple of decades, we've seen a shift where we have a lot more nutrient pollution, fertilizer pollution coming from these urban systems. We get a lot of folks that get really excited about feeding their plants. They go to the big box store, they buy a big old bag of fertilizer, they don't even read what it says, and they just start putting that product out. And we see that as a result of that, things like nitrogen or phosphorus, often far exceed what we really need in those landscapes. And when that nitrogen and phosphorus makes its way to our water, we can see a lot of consequences there, including some associated health risks like methemoglobinemia and subclinical hypothyroidism in women. We also see that if it moves into our surface water, it can cause something that we call eutrophication. And in a nutshell, that just means we feed a lot of the plants and the algae that live in that water. Those grow, they consume the oxygen and actually create dead zones where our fish and other aquatic life can't live anymore. So again, all of these practices are important and can have a really significant impact. So let's get started. First thing I always like to talk about is turf grass selection. This is really important. Right turf, right place. You've probably heard right plant, right place before. Same principle applies to turf. Not every turf is the right fit for every situation. So up here in North Texas and beyond, there's several things that we want to get out of our turf grass, right? A lot of times for many people, number one is going to be, I want it to look nice. Okay, so maybe it's never going to look as good as the palace at Versailles, which is what this picture is here. But if we can have something that looks relatively nice, relatively healthy, relatively manicured, that's going to be a big plus for many of us on this conversation today. We also want something that's functional. So turf is kind of a unique plant in the landscape where it's one of the few things that we incorporate into the landscape to support recreation and outdoor activity. So we have a lot of things that are beautiful to look at. We have a lot of things that we may grow because they're edible and we can eat them. But turf is going to be one of the few things where one of our main goals may be to have a space for our pets to play, have a space for our children to play. And so we need a species that's able to tolerate and support that activity. And then finally, we really want to increasingly have turf grasses that are resource use efficient. This means that they don't require a lot of water, they don't require a lot of fertilizer, they don't require too much time with mowing or other types of inputs in order to stay healthy and attractive. So if you know much about turf, maybe you do, maybe you don't, you probably know that we tend to divide turf grasses into two big categories. So we have cool season grasses, which if you're from up north or if you're from the Midwest, you've probably worked with cool season grasses before. This is going to include things like fescues, Kentucky bluegrass, and things like that. Then we've got our warm season grasses, and this is what we tend to see a lot more often here in Texas. And these two are fundamentally different. They're actually physiologically different from each other. So warm season grasses, which we tend to refer to as C4 plants, which describes their unique metabolism, tend to be more water use efficient. They tend to be more nitrogen use efficient. If you look at what their ideal temperature range is for shoot growth, it's 80 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. If I go over and I look at my cool season grasses, I'm going to see that they tend to grow best at temperatures between 60 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So I always tell people, your grasses are going to grow real well for about 2 weeks a year here in Texas, spring and fall. Those are each a week long, okay? And so we want something that's going to do well with our temperatures, which tend to be on the warmer side. Because they're more water use efficient, we also see that warm season grasses tend to be more drought hardy. They also very often tend to have better stress recovery. This is a really nice way of talking about all those runners or stolons and rhizomes that can sometimes be a downside to having these grasses too. If you've got Bermuda grass, if you've got St. Augustine grass, you are probably very familiar with the fact that those are going to often try to encroach into areas where you don't want them to grow. But the advantage to that is that if they become injured or damaged or suffer from disease, they're going to heal themselves and grow back over. If I've got a cool season grass, many of those grasses don't have that ability. They're what we call bunch type grasses, so they actually have to be reseeded in order to recover that area. Now, which grasses fall into each of these categories? Here's a list. So Here in the state of Texas, we have over 700 different species of grasses. Many of those are going to be either invasive weedy grasses, or they're used for forages, or they're used for biofuels. We've got about 14 or 15 that are used in some capacity for turf grass purposes. And here's 14 here, 7 warm season and 7 cool season. So chances are you recognize several on this list, but you may not recognize all of them. And there's a reason for that. Some of these are going to grow better in some parts of Texas than others. We know Texas is a huge state. There's a lot of variability, right? So the 2 most common grasses that we see grown for turf here in Texas are easily going to be Bermuda grass and St. Augustine grass. And that's very often what we'll see in many lawns up here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Now, number 3 or third place is going to be zoysia grass. We're seeing increasing interest in the use of zoysia grass, increasing popularity of this species. Texas A&M actually has a turf grass breeding program here in Dallas, and one of our 2 main grasses that we breed and grow here is zoysia grass, the other being St. Augustine grass. Then there's several others that you'll see on there. Centipede grass is typically something we see in far east Texas. Seashore paspalum we typically see along the coastal bend. Bahia grass we'll see more commonly used for roadside stabilization. And then buffalo grass we will see up here in the Metroplex quite often. It's one of our most common native grasses that we'll see used for turf up here, so we'll talk about that. And then we've got our cool season species. Now, most of the time, as I indicated, we don't recommend these a lot of times for home lawn use, especially not here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. We will occasionally see some tall fescue lawns. We will occasionally see some golf courses or athletic fields that are overseeded with some of these cool season grasses. But typically for a home lawn, these warm season grasses are going to serve us a lot better. Now, choosing the right turf grass is really important. We see that all of these grasses are going to be unique in terms of their shade tolerance, their irrigation tolerance, their mowing requirement, their traffic tolerance. So we want to take all of these things into consideration whenever we're picking the right turf grass for our lawn. And one thing we'll see very commonly here in North Texas and in other places is that a lot of times what we get when we build a home is not necessarily going to be the highest quality, best turf grass for the long run. We'll see that as properties grow and change and trees get bigger, that we may need to change our turf grass over time. So these are things we just have to be kind of tuned into. All of these species are going to have different degrees of drought tolerance or drought resistance. They're all going to have different irrigation watering requirements. So we'll talk about that in more detail tonight. Native turf grasses like buffalo grass are going to be far and away the most drought tolerant options that we have at our disposal, but they're still not the right fit for every situation. We see that our native grasses a lot of times are not as traffic tolerant. They're certainly not shade tolerant. They're not going to be as tolerant of some practices that a lot of homeowners like to employ, like having really short lawns. Buffalo grass and similar grasses, they're prairie grasses. And so they're going to do the best in systems where they can have a little bit taller height, fewer inputs, less traffic, and they can just kind of serve as a little sort of small prairie, okay? Then after that, we see Bermuda grass is definitely going to be very drought resistant. It can be a little bit more invasive, more aggressive. That can be something that's not very appealing sometimes for some people. So it's, again, all about trade-offs. We've got several different species of zoysia that we may see in North Texas landscapes. I'll talk about some of those here in more detail in a little bit, but some of them are going to be more drought resistant than others. We'll also see that St. Augustine, typically thought of as more of a moderate water user. I will share a little bit of news about that tonight from our turfgrass breeding program. But typically, we won't see that a lot of the St. Augustines that are currently available on the market, they're typically not going to be as drought tolerant as a lot of our Bermuda grasses, for example. So let's talk about each of these in just a little bit more detail. So Bermuda grass, this is Kyle Field if you're an Aggie. There you go. We see we may have common Bermuda grass, which is very popular for new home builds. It's cheap, it's easy to get. So we'll see a lot of times when a new house is being built, that's going to be kind of a go-to option. We will also, though, see the option to get a hybrid Bermuda grass. These are typically going to be more attractive. They're going to have a tighter growth habit. They're not going to be as invasive. They may have a nicer, richer color. So we'll see some of that out there as well. Bermuda is going to be a full sun option. It does not tolerate dense or moderate shade. May be able to tolerate some degree of partial shade. And we have some cultivars like Celebration, for example, that can tolerate just a little bit more shade, but it's not going to tolerate as much shade as something like St. Augustine grass. Again, it's going to be pretty drought tolerant compared to some of these others, which can be a big plus. It can require pretty frequent mowing. It can require a pretty regular fertilization in order to keep that healthy green habit. We will see that it's susceptible to certain insects, particularly things like fall armyworm or grubs, but it may be less susceptible to certain diseases than something like zoysia or St. Augustine. Another big, really popular feature about Bermuda grass is that it is very rapid to establish and very quick to recover. It can tolerate a decent amount of traffic. That's why we see Bermuda grass on a lot of our sports fields. It's able to tolerate that traffic and that activity better than some other species. And we can also purchase Bermuda grass as both seed and sod. And that's not true for every species that we're going to talk about tonight, including this one. So St. Augustine, again, St. Augustine, Bermuda, the two most popular turf grasses that we see. St. Augustine is going to have, as many of you know, a much thicker, denser, coarser texture to it. It's going to typically be a taller grass that prefers a taller mowing height. It's going to be very lush, and when it's healthy, it's going to keep a lot of weeds out. So that's a big plus. It's also going to be pretty shade tolerant. Now, it cannot grow in a dark room. It still needs about 5 to 6 hours of light a day, or some good partial light under a tree where that light's coming down from the branches. If you're in a really, really dark, heavily shaded area, you're going to have to consider probably an alternative to turf grass because they do have their limits. We will see St. Augustine can be a little bit more susceptible to certain diseases. We tend to call it sort of jokingly the diva of turf grass. It's going to be oversensitive if you do too little to it, and it's also going to be oversensitive if you do too much, which is actually what we see more often. We often see people overwater it and over-fertilize it, and this tends to stimulate disease and other issues. This is also not available as seed. As I mentioned, you have to purchase it vegetatively, so you're looking at plugs or sod. And similar to Bermuda grass, it's not going to have a whole lot of cold tolerance. Then we've got zoysia. So we've got, as I mentioned, several different types of zoysia grass. A lot of times we tend to divide these into two bigger categories. We've got coarse textured zoysias, which have a little bit thicker leaf blade. It's not quite as thick as St. Augustine, but it's much thicker than Bermuda. And then we have fine textured zoysias, which is what you see here in this picture. Depending on what you choose, you're going to get different strengths and different characteristics. So for a coarse textured zoysia, like Palisades zoysia or Jammer zoysia, we're going to see improved drought resistance and we're going to see better cold tolerance. We'll also see that those zoysia grasses tend to tolerate home lawn management practices better than a fine textured zoysia, which is going to typically prefer a little bit more technical expertise in order to really look good. So if we look at these, here we've got some pictures. So here on the left are some of our fine textured zoysias. So examples of this would be Xeon, Zorro, and we're going to see that fine textured zoysias tend to be a little bit more shade tolerant. Sometimes they can be almost as shade tolerant as St. Augustine grass, but they may not have some of the other features that a coarse textured zoysia or a Zoysia japonica has. So it's all about choosing the right one. And what you'll find about zoysias is that they tend to often be a little bit more expensive There are reasons for this. One reason being that they are slower growing. They're slower to establish. This means if I'm a sod farmer and I sell this grass, I get fewer harvests out of this grass than I do with something like Bermuda. So I have to charge more to justify using that land. And so that's one reason. We also see a lot of our zoysia grass cultivars are newer, which means they're still patented, they're still regulated, and there's an additional cost that comes with this. But the advantage to that is that a lot of times they're a very good quality. Finally, we've got our buffalo grass. So buffalo is the most popular native grass option for turf, but we will see some others in the mix sometimes. So you'll also see stuff like blue grama or curly mesquite. Sometimes we'll see those incorporated in a blend. Buffalo grass you can plant as either seed or sod. We do have some farms here in Texas that grow it. It is going to be, again, the most drought resistant option. As you can see here from this little map, it actually really doesn't like it to be too wet. And once we get too much rainfall, which Dallas is kind of right on the edge, we'll start to see that it gets outcompeted by Bermuda, outcompeted by weeds. It can start to get some disease issues. So it likes it to be a little bit drier. It's not going to have a very high fertilizer requirement. In fact, we can cause some issues by fertilizing this too much. We can see that it's going to tolerate just low to moderate traffic. So again, not going to be a really good fit if you've got big dogs or kids that are playing out in the yard a whole lot. But if you've got a front yard that's mostly just something that you want to be nice to look at, you want it to be a little bit more naturalized looking and have that nice native Texas prairie look, but be a little bit more manicured, buffalo grass can be a nice option for that. So there's a lot of different sources where you can learn more about some of the turf grasses that we have available. If you are interested in native options, then you can go someplace like Native American Seed or even the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. They have a seeded blend for lawns that's called Habiturf. So you can get a lot of resources there, seed there to go that route. If you're interested in sod, and you want to know what we're growing here in Texas, we actually have a producers organization and they have a website. It's texasgrass.com. And if you go on there, they actually have a method for you to do a homeowner search. And you can search for different species and cultivars of turf grass that we have here in Texas. You can search for which farms carry them. If you've got a truck and a trailer and you're willing to go pick it up yourself, a lot of times these farms will sell it to you direct by the pallet or the half pallet, so you can cut out the middleman if you're willing to lay that sod yourself. And so that is a resource that's available to you if you want to learn more. Another question I get a lot of times is, what if I need to do or want to do an alternative to turf grass? This has become increasingly popular in recent years, and sometimes, if we've got, again, a heavily shaded area, we may need to look at alternatives. This one that you see here in this photo is called frog fruit. It's a favorite of mine. Some people view it as kind of weedy, but I think it's really beautiful. It's popular with pollinators. It does pretty well in the shade. It's relatively drought tolerant. It's a native, so that can be a nice option. And it'll grow pretty well intermingled with some of our grasses. So you could try to plant this along with some buffalo grass to have sort of a unique native blend ground cover. If you've got full sun to partial shade, there's a lot of options you can explore. So creeping juniper, green Santolina, creeping phlox, dichondra, which is this one that you see down here at the bottom. It's got kind of that kidney bean leaf to it. So that's one that sometimes, again, people think of as a weed, but a lot of times they think it's weedy because it's growing better than their turf. And there's a reason for that sometimes. It may be that it tolerates the shade or it tolerates those conditions better than the turf grass does. We see that there are some mints and several plants in that mint family that make for nice alternative ground covers. Now, a lot of these species are not going to be well suited for areas that you want to walk through very often. This is going to be where you want something that's low growing and covers the entire soil surface, but otherwise you're going to keep off of it. If you've got partial shade to shade, there's that frog fruit. We also have things like bugleweed, green and purple oxalis. Which you'll see here's that purple oxalis there. So many of us will have that yellow wood sorrel or yellow oxalis, or you may think it's clover, but there's kind of a weedy version of this that can grow in our landscape. And so we know that if that's doing well there, that a family member that's more ornamental, more attractive, less invasive may also do well in that area. Bugleweed is a favorite of mine. That's what you see in this little upper left-hand corner. Little small, cute plants, usually with purple foliage and really attractive flowers. They're going to start to come out of dormancy here in a little bit, and they're just really beautiful every year in the spring and early summer. And then there's this horse herb. This is another one sometimes people think of as a weed. It can make for a nice alternative ground cover. I find it sometimes frustrating. My experience has been when I don't want it to grow, it grows everywhere. And when I do want it to grow, it doesn't. But maybe you'll have better luck than I have had. The other thing that's been kind of popular in recent years has been using sedges to create these sort of sedge lawns. So again, not necessarily an area we want to walk through, but if we just want something that's low growing, we want an alternative to something like Asiatic jasmine, which many of us, if you've got an older property, especially, you've probably got some of that in your landscape. You're looking for an alternative. You could do something like a Texas sedge or a Berkeley sedge and get a really beautiful look to it. I also do get questions sometimes about artificial or synthetic turf. I'm not a fan. I think there are a very small number of instances where this is appropriate. For example, maybe some limited areas around a pool or in areas that are otherwise very challenging to grow natural vegetation. But in general, if you can grow natural vegetation in your landscape, I think that is the more desirable option, especially up here in North Texas with the amount of rainfall that we get. Natural vegetation is going to help keep our water cleaner. It's going to promote greater infiltration and water capture or retention in the landscape. We also see that synthetic turf around the house can be very hot. So this was a picture I took a few years ago. It was in August in Texas. So yeah, it was hot. And just the St. Augustine was about 117 degrees Fahrenheit. When I went over to our synthetic turf research plots, which were actually intended to be one of the cooler synthetic turfs that are out there, it was almost 173 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot enough to burn the skin in less than 1 second of contact. So not going to make for a very pleasant space to go spend a lot of time outside. We do see that there's certain scenarios, big athletic fields at some facilities that need to use this just based on environmental conditions. But again, around your home, I would say up here in North Texas, try to find a natural option as much as you can. We're just going to get so many more positive environmental benefits out of that. All right, so let's talk a little bit. We've talked about picking the right turf. So now we need to know, how do I manage this effectively? One of the first things I always talk about is mowing. It's the practice that gets the most taken for granted and the most overlooked. Usually when I ask people about their mowing practices, they'll say something like, well, I go out there and I cut it as short as possible so that I don't have to go out again for another 2 or 3 weeks. And so what they're talking about there is really short mowing and really infrequent mowing. And those really aren't the practices that we want to promote. When we employ practices like that, what we're really doing is scalping the turf, and that puts our lawn in shock, which is going to make it less resilient. It's going to increase the amount of inputs that we need to keep it healthy. It's going to allow weeds to move in. And so it really can be really problematic. So in general, rule of thumb is that the taller your turf grass is, the deeper your roots are. And at the end of the day, if you take nothing else away from this program tonight, I want you to try to have deeper roots in your lawn. People take this so for granted, and they so misunderstand how deeply their turf grasses can root. When I ask people this question, how deeply do you think Bermuda grass can root? Most people say, oh, probably about 4 inches. When Bermuda grass has an ideal soil and it's managed appropriately, it can root several feet, sometimes 10 to 12 to 13 feet deep in the soil. It is a very effective plant at rooting deeply. And so while we may see that a lot of our roots can be concentrated up a little bit closer to the soil surface, if we adopt certain practices, we can push those roots deeper and deeper and deeper. And when we get those deeper roots, we get a lot of benefits. The first benefit is better water infiltration. That means the water is going to soak into my soil and into my yard a lot more effectively. I'll see less runoff because all of those little roots that I'm growing deep into that soil become channels for water to now move deeper into that soil. I'm also going to see that those roots can now access water and nutrient resources that are deeper in the soil. That means that those roots, that plant is not going to require me to come out as often and provide water and provide nutrients. I'm encouraging it to become a more resilient plant. I'm going to see improved overall stress tolerance. So when I encourage this really deep, healthy rooting, if I get a freeze the way that I've gotten the last couple of years, I'm going to see a greater likelihood for survival because my plant has more reserves and more going on below that soil where the soil can insulate and keep things warm and protected. If all of my roots are up toward the surface, I'm not going to see the same level of resilience. Same goes for any kind of stress that we may see in the landscape. So if I've got a lot of traffic on that yard, a little bit taller turf, a little bit deeper roots, I'm going to tolerate that traffic better than if I am encouraging that shallow root growth. I'll also see that taller turf grass is going to typically be more competitive against weeds. Anytime I mow so short that the soil becomes exposed, I'm putting light on those weed seeds and allowing them to germinate. I'm putting my turf grass in shock, which makes it harder to compete with that weed and allows that weed to start to take over that area. And then this is kind of counterintuitive, but the taller my turf grass is, actually the less often I have to mow. And I'll explain that here in just a second. But we want deeper roots. The first step to getting there is having a little bit taller mowing height. Now, what I'll typically tell people, is this time of year, it's okay to go out and mow pretty short, get all of that dead junk and debris out of there from last year and from the winter. And then as we start to warm up more, you're going to want to gradually allow that turf to get taller and taller and taller. So by the time we get to June, July, and it starts to get really hot and really dry, I have trained that turf to build those deep roots and I've set it up to be successful. Now, what is mowing height? What does that mean when I say taller mowing height? Well, here's some examples of what these height ranges tend to look like for some of these species. And so, while we can keep a little bit shorter, more cropped look, again, as we get into the hotter and drier parts of summer, we want to get on the upper end of this recommended height range for whatever species I have. So where I see people being really the guiltiest of this is when they have St. Augustine. We see a lot of people try to mow St. Augustine way too short. It is not going to like to be mowed at a 2-inch height the way that Bermuda grass is. It's typically going to do better in the summertime if by the time we get to July, August, that St. Augustine is about 4 inches tall. That's about where I get mine every year, and I very rarely have to irrigate it. And I see that it performs much better than a lot of my neighbors' yards who are out there mowing it really, really short over and over again. So we want to pay attention to what is the recommended height range, and we want to stay on the upper end of that. The other big part of this is going to be mowing frequency. We want to mow in response to the rate of growth, which I know is really challenging. We all are very busy. It's hard to really be able to do that effectively. But typically what we want to follow is something called the 1/3 rule. That means that when I go out and mow, I don't want to remove more than about 1/3 of that leafy green height each time I mow. If you go out there and you're mowing off half or more of those leaves, that height each time, you are scalping that turf and you are stressing that turf. And you're taking away its food source, right? We remember that plants need those leaves to photosynthesize and produce food. So when you mow too much of that off at one time, that plant is going to panic. You're taking its food source away. And what it ends up doing a lot of times is it pulls backup food out of its roots. And then we lose that root depth and we lose that root growth. So we want to try to make sure that we mow frequently enough that we only remove about a third of that total height at any one time. So if you've got a hybrid Bermuda grass lawn and you're trying to keep it at about 2 inches, by the time it gets to 3, you need to get out there and try to get it mowed. If you do get a little bit overgrown, which will happen, this time of year we get some rainfall like we did yesterday, then we want to try to gradually take it back down instead of going out and lopping it all off at once. We want to start by taking off a little at a time until we get it back to our desired height, if possible. My other recommendation for mowing, besides keep your mower clean and sharp, is going to be to mulch your clippings. So this is something we get a lot of confusion about. Typically what I would say is if you're mulching your clippings, meaning you're letting your clippings go back out on your lawn, you can reduce your nitrogen fertilizer by as much as 50%. And you want to make sure that you do that, or then you're going to have too much nitrogen going into that system. So it's a nutrient savings. You're recycling nitrogen naturally in that system. You're recycling that plant food naturally in that system. Now, this really works the best when you're following that 1/3 rule, right? I know if I go out and I'm mowing, mowing 4 inches of turf off, I'm going to end up with a big blanket of clippings on that turf, and then I'm going to smother it. But if I'm following the 1/3 rule, my clippings are a reasonable size, I'm going to see a lot of benefits from this mulching. The only exception to this is going to be if you have any kind of pest infestation. So if you have a severe weed problem and you don't want those weeds to spread, particularly if they're flowering or producing seed, you need to bag and remove the clippings. Same is true as if you've got a disease or a significant insect issue, anything that could be dispersed by those clippings. You want to go ahead, bag, remove them, treat them kind of like biohazard material. And then once you resolve that issue, you can start to mulch those clippings again. All right, now we're on to watering. This is important. So a couple things that not everybody knows. So here in the state of Texas, you may or may not have known that we actually regulate irrigation licenses. So if you are paying somebody to come out and do professional work on your irrigation system, they should be licensed by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. So this is something that you can ask about. You can also, if you want to find a licensed irrigator in your area, you can visit the TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality website. They actually have a homeowner landscape irrigator search where you put in your zip code. So this is in Plano where I live. So I pulled up several of the licensed irrigators that were here in my area a couple of years ago when I made this slide. I just like for people to know this, so that if you're paying somebody to come out, you know exactly what kind of credentials they should have to be working on your system. Now, when we talk about irrigation, this can be kind of an overwhelming topic for a lot of people. We see that different sprinkler heads, different nozzles are going to have different degrees of efficiency. Dean will talk about this in some upcoming programs in more detail, but I did want to give kind of a brief overview here of what we might see. Maybe you go home tonight if you've got an in-ground sprinkler system and you play with this and you try to figure out what do I have? So one thing that we'll see pretty commonly as kind of the default for our irrigation systems here is going to be this fixed spray nozzle that you see here on the left. So this is going to be very popular, very common for a home lawn irrigation installation. And it is also the least efficient option that we see on this list up here. It's going to have a very small droplet, so you can imagine immediately how easy it would be for a windy day for that water to get blown off. We don't get that contact with the soil or that contact with the plants, so that's not very efficient. We also see that it has a pretty high output rate. And so we can see that when we're using this type of sprinkler head, this type of nozzle, that we can overload the soil pretty quickly and see a lot of runoff. So if you've played it all in your soil, you know that we have some really charming Very sticky, very heavy soils up here in North Texas. You may or may not have known that we actually have a state soil of Texas. So you probably knew we have a state bird and we have a state tree. We actually have a state soil of Texas. It's the Houston black clay, which is a very sticky, shrinking, swelling kind of gumbo clay. It is the wonderful feature that affects many of our foundations. It shrinks and swells under various soil moistures. When we have dry periods, we're going to see it crack. And we also will see that it can sometimes be a challenge to get water into that soil. So we want our irrigation to be as low and as slow as possible to really encourage that water move into our soil and not run off into the street. So one thing we can do is we can actually replace these fixed spray nozzles with something called a multi-stream rotary nozzle. So maybe you've seen these before. They're going to produce these heavier streams of water. It's kind of hypnotic to watch it, sort of relaxing, very meditative. These are going to have a lower output. They're not going to put out as much water. So I may need to run this type of system twice as long as I run a fixed spray system to put out the same amount of water. Okay, but because I'm putting it out lower, slower, and in heavier droplets, I'm more likely to see that water come into contact with my soil and move into my soil. So that is one option. We'll also see with larger turf grass areas. So if you've got a huge yard or you like to go play soccer or play golf, you may see these rotor heads. They're going to have gears inside of them that are actually going to physically move. And these are going to be similar efficiency to these multi-stream rotary nozzles, but they just cover a much bigger area. And then finally, our most efficient irrigation delivery method is going to be drip irrigation. Now, all of these are going to come with pros and cons, and we will see that drip irrigation, there is some increasing popularity in using this for turf grass, where we actually see some new communities putting this in underneath the turf. I'm excited that we're moving in that direction, but there's still some challenges we have to figure out from a management standpoint. I know several people that have had that have struggled with certain aspects of it, but certainly for many other parts of the landscape, vegetable gardens, landscape beds, ornamental beds, trees, drip is going to be a really, really strong way to go. And it's going to allow you to irrigate some really oddly shaped and unique areas. Now, if you're using a hose-in sprinkler, you're actually in the best position to be as efficient as possible with your water. You know, if you really take the time to go out, set it up, do it yourself, we tend to see less water wasted with that kind of approach. But a lot of us up here in North Texas increasingly have an in-ground sprinkler system. We've got automated irrigation, and we want to make sure that if we're using this type of irrigation, we're only using it to supplement rainfall. So last night, 9:15 at night on the dot, my next door neighbor's irrigation came on. Never mind that it was pouring rain. It came on like clockwork. And that really comes down to something that we see a lot of Texans still very guilty of, which is setting it and forgetting it. So we really want to try to be mindful of when our system is running. We want to try to have mechanisms for it to shut off if we do experience rainfall events. I'll talk about that a little bit, and Dean will talk about that a lot when he does his program. And we just want to make sure that when we're using these systems, we're using them responsibly and as efficiently as possible. A lot of things that we see here in Texas and North Texas related to irrigation issues. The most common is going to be overwatering. We see a lot of people really, I mean, they're trying to do right by their plants and their landscapes. You know, the way that I a lot of times will put this is over-loving. See a lot of people that overlove their landscapes. They overestimate what their landscape and what their lawn really needs. And as a result, they're just watering way too much. We also see some issues with improper irrigation system design and installation. You know, certainly we'll see up here that as the landscape evolves over time, an irrigation system that made sense 20 years ago, maybe it doesn't make sense anymore. We'll see, you know, if you purchased a home that's been owned by 4 people before you, Well, maybe who knows what they did to that irrigation system? You may have a Frankenstein system, right? That's been messed with by several people. We'll see a lot of issues with people watering the wrong time of day, the wrong time of year, the wrong frequency and duration. I had a neighborhood in Fort Worth a few years ago where a landscape contractor was advising homeowners to water at least twice per week all winter long. Well, we don't need to do that here in North Texas. We do not need to water twice per week during a time of year where we get a lot of natural rainfall and our turf grasses are not actively growing and not taking that water up. The reason I was called into that situation is because a lot of the lawns in that neighborhood rotted away because of how they were being just oversaturated with water all winter long. We also see a lack of routine maintenance. So we see a lot of people, unfortunately, they just we get busy. It's hard for us to keep up with these things, and we'll see that we've got a broken head or a subsurface leak or a broken nozzle or clogged nozzle, and we just may not be aware of it. And that system may be running at a time of day that we're asleep or that we're not out there paying attention, and then we start to waste water without meaning to. Now, I'm not going to get into this in too much detail, but I'm going to tell you that if you start to look up how much do I water, most of those recommendations are going to come in the form of inches per week. Okay. And that is based on something called evapotranspiration. It's a combination of two terms: evaporation, which is water lost from soil and the surrounding surfaces, and transpiration, which is water lost from plants. Transpiration occurs through this process. Again, I'm not going to get into this too much, but I'm telling you this so that you know there's a lot of science actually that goes into estimating how much we should water. And when we get those recommendations, this means that we have to know exactly how long to run our irrigation system to put out a certain number of inches. And most of us just don't know that. When I ask people, well, how much do you water? They'll say, oh, like 20 minutes. Well, what does that mean? How many inches are we actually putting out? And so one thing I would really encourage you to do is try to get familiar with the precipitation rate for your system. In other words, if you run that system for 15 minutes, how many inches are you putting out? Because if you really want to be water efficient, you really want to be effective and give your turf, you also want to make sure you give your turf enough water, right, to keep it healthy. Well, we've got to know how long to run our system to really understand what we're doing. So one thing that we can do is something called a catch can test. You'll find a number of videos online that will walk you through how to do this. These always look like little plastic champagne glasses to me that you give to like a kid with some Welch's grapefruit juice or something. But these are catch cans. They go into the soil. We would distribute those evenly within an irrigation zone. You don't have to purchase those. You can use tuna fish cans or cat food cans or coffee cans, but you'll distribute those within your irrigation zone, similar to what you see here. Typically 5 to 9 per zone is going to help you get what you need. And you're going to run your irrigation zone for about 5 minutes if you have those fixed spray nozzles, or around 10 to 15 if you have rotary nozzles. And you're going to see what you catch. Right? And this is going to tell me two things. One, it's going to tell me, again, that precipitation rate. Two, it's going to tell me how uniform is that coverage. Because I could have a head that's not rotating properly, in which case I may see that half of these cans catch a very different amount than the other half. So that's good for me to know as well. I do some basic math to calculate, based on what I capture in that 15 minutes. How long do I need to run this zone to put out, let's say, half an inch, which is commonly what we might recommend for a single watering. That's going to give me a nice deep watering, half an inch, right? So I'll do some very basic math there. Now, if you don't want to mess with doing a catch can test, or you just cannot get out there to do that, you can do the bare minimum and put a rain gauge out there one day and just try to get some sense of what that output is so that you can make a little bit more informed decision. I'm going to move through this a little bit because we're running a little short on time. So once I do that, I'll know exactly how long to run my zones. And these are some examples here. So this isn't 100% accurate, but it's going to give you some idea. If you've got these different types of sprinklers, how long are you having to run that zone to put out about half an inch of water? Okay. And as I mentioned earlier, right, if I've got those spray nozzles, well, I'm running each zone for about 24 minutes, I have to pretty much double that if I've got the multi-stream rotary or the rotor heads in order to put out that same amount of water. For drip, I've got to run it even longer. The lower and slower it is, the longer I have to run that system to put out my desired output. Now, fortunately up here, sometimes when I do these classes, I have to sit down and teach people how to actually do the math based on our weather stations across the state to estimate how much they need to water, because we have a lot of parts of the state that do not have access to this. But fortunately, up here in North Texas, most of us do. So this is a feature called Water My Yard. You can go check it out. It's watermyyard.org. You put in your address and it'll text you or email you weekly watering recommendations. Okay, so it'll tell you, this week based on the weather, you need to water about 1/2 inch. We've done our catch can test. We know I need to water each zone for about 50 minutes to put out 1/2 inch of water. Other principles, really important that we prioritize watering deeply and infrequently. This is very counterintuitive to people, but we talked about the importance of deep rooting. We talked about the importance of having a taller mowing height. This is the other really important piece of that puzzle, getting those deeper roots. If I go out and let's say that I irrigate and I water the upper 6 inches of soil. So I put out 1/2 inch of water, it goes through and it wets the upper 6 inches. As that starts to dry down between waterings, it's going to dry down from the top, from the soil surface. And as the soil surface and the top of that soil starts to dry down, my roots are going to reach for that water that's still there deeper in the soil. So it's really encouraging and driving those roots to go grow deeper and reach deeper. If I go out there and I water just a little bit every day, what I'm actually doing is I'm making little codependent plant babies that sit there with their roots in the upper couple of inches of soil, and they wait with their little plant mouth open for me to give them their little spritz of water each day. So that's not what I want. I don't want a little codependent plant baby. I want a resilient, strong plant that's got deep roots and has been tortured just enough with love to have the roots that it needs to respond to drought if it comes. So deep and infrequent. And what that means for us up here in North Texas is that twice per week is more than enough. We hear a lot of complaints sometimes when we go under drought ordinances about, oh, the city's only letting me water twice a week. Well, when I water deeply and I build those deep roots, twice per week is more than enough. In fact, that's what we recommend even for professional grade turf. So I'll use Kyle Field, that football field in College Station, as an example. Each year, our sports turf manager, he makes sure to create these deep root systems to where he can get to a point in the summer where he only waters that field every 14 days. So really, really important to do deep and infrequent watering. This is a best practice. It's absolutely essential to getting those deeper roots in our landscape. I did want to throw in a couple of little fun examples for you guys to really drive this home. So there's a new cultivar of turf that's been out for a few years now called Tiff Tuff. It's from the University of Georgia turfgrass breeding program. It is the most drought resistant turfgrass we currently have on the market. And there was a study done a couple of years ago to look at its rooting depth. And a lot of these new grasses, these new turf grasses that are coming out that are very drought resistant, they get that drought resistance from something called drought avoidance. It's a specific type of mechanism. And that mechanism relies upon their ability to build those deep roots. Okay. So in the case of Tiff Tuff, we actually saw over 40% of its roots were between 6 and 18 inches. So they're not up there at the surface. This plant gets its drought avoidance from its ability to go very deep, a couple feet deep. So we really want to try to encourage that. This is just one cultivar, but I mentioned St. Augustine earlier. Texas A&M has a new turf grass coming out. It'll be available more widely starting 2023. It's called Cobalt St. Augustine, Cobalt. It uses 60 to 80% less water than any St. Augustine currently on the market. And it does that because of this, because of its ability to have deep roots. So this is really, really important. We've also seen this in years past with other studies performed. This was a study done in San Antonio several years ago where they restricted turfgrass root zones to 4 inches. Then they subjected these turf grasses to a 60-day drought. Every turf grass that could only grow roots in the upper 4 inches died after that 60-day drought. But in turf grasses where they were allowed to root as deeply as they wanted, all of them survived that 60-day drought. Now, they may not look very pretty during that 60-day period, but they survived it. So again, just really important, encouraging that deep root growth. Some of that comes from many of these practices we've talked about today. Some of it also comes from good site preparation. So we see a lot of times, if you do a turf renovation or you build a new lawn, there's a lot of ways that can go wrong. we see that a lot of the good soil's removed. We see a lot of heavy equipment on that soil that compacts it. And so we want to put the same time and care into preparing the soil for turf that we would put into preparing a new vegetable garden. We want to incorporate some compost. We want to incorporate some expanded shale. And we want to create a situation where that soil is going to support deep, healthy roots, because that's when we're going to get a lot of benefits. We're going to see reduced watering requirement. We're going to see a healthier overall lawn with fewer inputs. So I won't get into this. This is we've already touched on this a little bit, but it's just taking time to prepare. I do a lot of other classes on this, so if this is something you're interested in, just let me know. I'm happy to share more information on what this can look like, but it is just a really important practice. Another thing that we can do to encourage water to move more deeply, which we now know is going to encourage my roots to grow deeper, is to cycle and soak. And I think this is something Dean will talk about in future classes more as well. This is so important for North Texas. You think about our heavy soils, you think about our slopes. Even if I determine I've already swapped my nozzles out, I've done my catch can test, I've got my multi-stream rotary, I know I need to run them for 50 minutes. Well, even if I've done all of that right, I know that if I run it all at once in 50 minutes, some of that may run off, depending on my yard. And so cycle and soak is going to take that 50 minutes and it's going to parcel it up into multiple cycles to where I'm pulsing that water in more gradually. So let's say, for example, that I take that and I decide I'm going to do 4 cycles for 10 to 15 minutes each, and I'm going to have a 30 to 60 minute rest in between. So instead of 50 continuous minutes, I hit it for a little bit, give that water time to soak in, I come back, I hit it again. In terms of how we program this, it's something that varies a little bit from system to system, but a lot of the new irrigation systems already have this feature built in for programming. Older systems, a lot of times we can find information on YouTube or on the manufacturer website. And again, I think this is something Dean will talk about in some future programs in more detail. But this is another practice that we can employ to get that water deeper in the soil, encourage those deeper roots, and reduce runoff into our street. I also do want to make sure I touch briefly on this concept of summer dormancy. So when we do have really deep, healthy roots with a lot of these warm season grasses, they can actually go into something called summer dormancy, which is a really nice feature that we often take for granted. And what this means is if these grasses have that healthy root system and they experience a 30 or 60-day drought, we have something really extreme like we did back in 2011. These grasses may lose their color. They may go dormant, very similar to what they do in the wintertime. So they suspend growth. They recognize, whoa, I'm in an extreme environmental situation right now. I'm going to stop my growth temporarily. And they'll go blonde. So sometimes we've heard it jokingly called going blonde for summer. I know I've heard Daniel Cunningham say that before. And so, this is kind of a nice feature because then what happens is in the late summer or fall, when we get rainfall again, it'll green back up and it'll recover. So it's really making ourselves okay with our turf grass being a little bit different color, allowing it to go into the summer dormancy when we do have those really extreme events, and trusting that it's going to come back once rainfall is available again. When possible, we want to prioritize watering in early morning hours. So midday watering is a big no-no. We just have much higher evaporative losses, a lot of wind that moves that water around. If you're trying to get something established, that's a little bit different. But once it's established, it needs to be typically early morning watering before the wind picks up, before the sun comes up a lot of times. Evening watering can be okay. It's better than midday, but I will caution you that it tends to leave water on the leaves too much overnight, and particularly with some species like St. Augustine or Zoysia, this can promote disease, especially if we do it in the spring or fall. So instead, I would encourage you to focus on watering sometime between about 3 and 8 a.m. I'm trying to get your cycle and soak through during that time period. That way, when the sun comes up, everything dries fairly quickly, everything's been taken up fairly quickly, and the turf can go about its day. We also want to make sure that we have rain and freeze sensors if you've got a sprinkler system. Rain sensor is going to keep it from going off when it's raining outside because nobody wants to be that person. Freeze sensor is going to protect your irrigation system components, and it's going to prevent road hazards as well. So a couple years ago on Valentine's Day, we had a freeze overnight. I was driving over on Hebron, near Hebron and Josie, and there was a sprinkler system that had flooded into the right-hand lane of Hebron overnight and had created a little mini ice rink that people weren't expecting, and it caused a 4-vehicle accident. So not only is this just not an appropriate time to irrigate, and not only can it damage your irrigation system, but you can cause accidents as well, depending on what happens to that water. All right, some quick tips for fertilizing. Test your soil, okay? Don't guess, soil test. If you test your soil, it's going to help you know what does your soil actually need in order to support healthy plant growth. It's not very expensive to submit this to Texas A&M. It's usually $12 to $20 per sample. You'll just sample at about a 6-inch depth. It's best to have 10 to 15 smaller samples across the yard that you combine in a bucket. That way you get a good average of what's going on in that yard. What you see in the center of this picture here is a soil probe, so that can make it easier. It's about $75. If you're just a passive lawn person, it may not be something you want to spend money on. But if you think you're going to get really into this, maybe put it on your holiday list or birthday list or something like that. And make sure you get one with a foot peg, because our soils are hard and you want to be able to put a bunch of weight behind them. When you get your soil test back, it's going to tell you what your nutrient availability and your pH are. If you're ever curious about what any of this means, you can talk to your county extension agent. You guys have a fabulous Denton County agent if you're in Denton County, named Janet Laminack. You also have a good Ag and Natural Resources agent named Zach Davis. You're welcome to contact me. Those of us at the Dallas Center, you're welcome to contact the Soil Testing Lab. So you can get help, and they will give you recommendations on that report as to what they think you should be doing to keep your yard healthy. A lot of times, for example, what we see up here is that we really don't need phosphorus, but people put a ton of it out anyways. And so if you don't need it, we don't want to put it out. It's a waste of money, and it can actually pollute our environment to put too much of that out. So this can be very helpful. We want to fertilize when turf is actively growing. This ensures that the turf grass takes it up and we don't lose it in the larger environment. So what I usually tell people is that you can fertilize for the first time in the spring when you've mowed your grass, not your weeds, but your grass twice. That is going to indicate to you that it's actively growing and it's ready for that fertilizer. We also want to make sure that we don't fertilize too late in the year. So when we did have the freeze a few years ago, the most damage that I saw across the state was from people that were trying to keep their turf really green through those colder months. And so fertilizer can play a big role in that. And unfortunately, what that does is it gives you too much succulent, vulnerable tissue. And then when a freeze comes through, it's going to be a lot more vulnerable. So typically we want to make our last fertilizer application about 6 to 8 weeks before the historic first frost date. So a lot of times for us here in North Texas, we're looking at late September, early October to make that final application. And a lot of times I'll tell people Labor Day is a pretty good time to make your final fertilizer application. And then you need to to stop for the year and kind of let the plant naturally prepare for winter. If you've got a much older lawn, you can actually fertilize less typically. So if you've got an older house, older property, you may try, if you're using a lot of fertilizer right now, you may try scaling that back and see if your turf grass does okay. We see that yards that are over 25 years in age just often do not require the same amount. They get a nice natural system going, good microbial activity. They just don't need it. On the flip side, if you've got a brand new yard that you're trying to get established, just remember that that turf grass doesn't have a full root system yet. So we don't want to put out full rates of fertilizer. We typically want to spoon feed at a lower rate until that turf grass is more established. Keep fertilizer on the lawn. This is really important if we want to protect our water. We want to try to keep these prills and fertilizer spray from being on our sidewalk where stormwater can pick it up and carry it away. So if you do leave material like this behind, just go out there with a broom and sweep it back onto your turf. Make sure you choose the right equipment. This is going to help you make sure that you get good coverage so you don't end up with something like this. Although I always think this kind of looks sort of cool. So just pay attention. Make sure you do take some time to do the math right. What I'll recommend a lot of times to folks is calculate how much you need and then put your spreader on the lowest setting and walk in 2 directions. This is going to just help make sure you get good coverage and you don't get halfway through your lawn and you've already used up all your fertilizer somehow. All right, we've got about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to do just a few pest management basics because I know these are popular questions, and one reason I really like to talk about this is that this is another area where a lot of times we see some overloving happening and some panic decisions where people will assume they have a problem, they pick a product, they put it out, and sometimes they do more harm than good with that product. So I really want to encourage you to be very patient and very cautious about the decisions you make when it comes to pest management. This is going to help protect your turf. It's going to help protect our water. It's going to help protect other organisms that like to visit our yard. So what I always recommend is, and this is what we teach landscape professionals too, is try to have what we call an integrated pest management strategy. This means that we don't just rely on spraying products. The big thing I can tell you about lawns is that when you have a big problem with a pest, a lot of times it's an indication that there's another underlying issue. And if all I do is spray a pesticide and I don't fix that underlying issue, that problem's going to probably just keep coming back. And so integrated pest management encourages me to think about the whole system and to think about what might those underlying issues be and how can I also treat those. And so usually when I talk about this, I talk about 5 major factors. So we'll just go through these really quickly. The first is preventative control. This is what I like to call my don't be dumb policy. And I say that jokingly, but it's recognizing that anytime we bring something new into our landscape, whether it's new compost, new topsoil, new sand, new seed, whatever it is, new plants, they can bring pest problems with them. So as much as possible, we want to just be aware of this. We want to try to responsibly source our material. We want to be mindful too of how pests can be introduced on our shoes, on equipment. So, you know, certainly we have some weeds that like to hitchhike on the bottoms of shoes. Certainly we have some diseases and insects that can be carried around on mowers. So we want to just be mindful of all of those things. Then we've got cultural control. This is everything we've talked about tonight. Good mowing, good irrigation, good fertilization to keep the turf healthy and happy. When we do this and we have those deep roots and we've got a good balance to everything, typically we are just not going to have nearly as many pest issues, okay? Especially when it comes to weeds. The more competitive we keep that turf, the fewer weeds we're going to have. So we want to think about what are the best practices I can have out there, having that little bit taller mowing height, making sure I don't scalp that turf, making sure I have deep and infrequent irrigation, and I'm only fertilizing when I need to. Those are all really important practices. Mechanical control is just remembering that we can always go out and pull weeds by hand, even if it's maybe not our favorite thing to do. Put your kids to work. give them a penny for every weed that they collect, or a nickel. I'd probably go broke in some yards if I did that, but but you can do that. We can have mulch in our landscape beds. That's going to help with some weeds. If you've got garden beds that you work in, it doesn't stop all of them, but it's definitely going to stop some. The enemy of the sustainable landscape is bare soil. So anytime you have bare soil, please cover it up, plant something, or put some mulch down. We've got biological control. So if you've got backyard chickens, or a goat, or guineas, or something like that, those can be forms of biological control. And there's other things we can do as well. And then finally, we've got our chemical control. And chemical control can be box store synthetic pesticides. It can also be organic pesticides. So any chemical that we use to control or suppress pests are going to fall into that category. And we want to treat all of them with respect. So if you're talking about weeds, big important thing is you got to know your weeds. I get a lot of people every year that use the wrong herbicide for the type of weed that they're dealing with. And so take the time to really try to get to know what weeds you're dealing with. This can be another great excuse to contact your county office. The Denton County Master Gardeners, for example, can be very knowledgeable, very helpful with things like this. Get to doing some digging around on the internet. We want to, at the very least, know, are you dealing with a grassy weed or a broadleaf weed? Typically, the herbicides that we use to control each of these are very different. So every year I get a lot of people that try to control grassy weeds with a broadleaf herbicide, which means they're wasting time, money, and putting out a pesticide that they don't need and that is not going to help them. And so get to know them. Grassy weeds are going to have striped veins on the leaf. They're going to have a fibrous root system. They're going to have flower parts in multiples of 3. Broadleaf weeds are going to have a taproot. Think about a dandelion. Okay, when you pull that up, they're going to have netted veins on the leaf that are going to be more complex looking. They're going to have flower parts in multiples of 4 or 5. We also kind of need to know, am I dealing with annual, perennials, or biennial weeds? Different products are going to be more or less effective depending on what I'm dealing with. Annual weeds are going to come back every year from seed. They're going to complete their life cycle in one growing season. So crabgrass, annual bluegrass, or poana, all of these are going to be annual weeds. Biennial weeds will complete their life cycle in 2 growing seasons. So thistles, for example, are going to be a lot of times biennials. And then many of us have the pleasure of dealing with perennial weeds up here, which are weeds that are going to come back year after year after year. So Dallas grass is what you see in this picture. That's a very common perennial weed that we deal with up here. It has really deep roots, really deep rhizomes. And if I want to get rid of that weed, a lot of times it's going to take a big shovel and a deep hole because we have very few products that are going to control it effectively. That's good for me to know so that I don't waste a lot of time and money and energy putting out products that aren't going to work. When we talk about herbicides, we have pre and post-emergence herbicides. They do different things. Pre-emergence herbicides form a barrier on the soil. They stop your little annual seedlings from coming up out of the soil. Post-emergence herbicides we use once the weeds come up. Unfortunately, when we go to the big box store, they don't make this very easy on us to tell what's what. I do have a guide. I can share it with Blake, and he can share it maybe somehow, but I've got a guide that kind of breaks this down a little bit more. Typically for a pre-emergence, if this is something you want to have in your program, we recommend 2 applications a year. One is for summer annual weeds, one is for winter annual weeds. We put these products out a lot of times based on soil temperature. In the fall or in the spring, we typically put out a pre-emergent here toward late February, so typically the 3rd or last week of February. In the fall here in North Texas, we typically put out a pre-emergent toward the end of September. So we want to get those products out before those little weeds start to germinate and emerge. If you do use a post-emergent product, make sure it's the right product, that it's labeled and safe to use on your turf. You get people every year that accidentally kill or injure their yard because they used the wrong herbicide on their turf. Put it out early when the weeds are vulnerable and young, they're susceptible. Make sure that the weeds you're trying to control are also on that product label. Not all herbicides are created equal. And be really careful about putting products out around other plants. We will definitely see accidental injury or damage of plants that we don't mean to get with these. So we want to, again, treat these with a lot of respect, really read and pay attention to the label, and don't hesitate to contact an expert if you're ever not sure. I'm going to just talk briefly about two diseases that we see a lot up here. One is called large patch. You may call it brown patch, but in warm season turf grass, just to make things complicated, we scientists now call this large patch. So it is going to form these circular patches in the turf. We'll see this most often on St. Augustine and zoysia lawns, but it can show up in any warm season lawn. They're going to have rounded edges. A lot of times we may see in the spring, for example, that those edges have kind of a gold or orange look to them. Okay. There's a lot of things that we can do to prevent this disease, including avoiding evening watering, avoiding overwatering in the fall and early spring, avoiding over-fertilizing. If we've got low spots or dips in our lawn, those areas are going to be more susceptible because water will pool there. So that may be an opportunity to think about correcting those areas if you're seeing disease develop in those areas a lot. We will typically recommend fungicides for this in the fall, but you need to confirm that this is the disease that you have before you make those, because there are some look-alike things, and we don't want to use a fungicide if we don't really need that fungicide. Another big disease we see up here occasionally is take-all root rot. It's not going to be as rounded as large patch. It's going to be more irregular shaped patches. A lot of times the first thing that we will see is this kind of tie-dye yellowing in the yard. Very common St. Augustine lawns throughout Texas. This is going to be a lot of times, let me tell you guys the conditions in which we typically see this disease, and you tell me if this sounds familiar, okay? Alkaline soils, okay? Extreme soil moisture fluctuations. So dry, wet, dry, wet, dry, wet. Extreme temperature fluctuations. And overuse of certain herbicides. So these are all common things that we see here in Texas. And so anything that might be affecting root growth can create issues or increase the likelihood of this disease. So again, if you suspect you have this disease, contact an expert, contact your county extension office, get some input, get some help, get some advice. We see with this disease in particular, a fungicide alone is not going to cut it. It's not enough. So you need that input, you need those tips on how to really get a holistic approach, holistic control, and to really be able to effectively control this disease. I'm going to kind of move forward here. Anytime you suspect you have a disease issue, you can actually send samples. Texas A&M AgriLife has a disease diagnostic lab. It needs to be a good sample. So you got to pull it from the outer edge of where you think that disease is. Because let me tell you something, if I pull this sample from the middle here, that disease is probably not there anymore. It already ate what it wanted to there. So we want to go to the outer edge because that's where the disease is most active. So I kind of want a mixture of like pretty healthy turf still and then infected turf. And I want to have roots and all. And I'm going to put it in a big Ziploc and I'm going to ship it to College Station as quickly as possible, right? I don't want it sitting in the mail in August for 2 weeks. That's not going to be a good sample. But they can help look at that for you if you suspect there's an issue and help you figure out what that issue is. Main insect pests we'll see here in Texas in the summer are going to be grubs, which are going to be most active in June, July, August. Best time to treat is typically June, July. Make sure they are in your turf. We have several beneficial grubs that like to live in gardens and compost bins. Don't squish those. They're good. They're compost feeding grubs. We only want to control grubs if they're a problem in our turf and we're seeing evidence of that problem, meaning the turf is suffering or you've got an armadillo that won't stop digging up your yard, okay? You're seeing probably the June bugs visit right now. They're coming in to where you have lights on at night. They're laying eggs. They're getting ready. So if you're seeing a lot of those, keep an eye on your turf. Don't use an insecticide if you don't have to. Those insecticides are going to potentially harm beneficial insects. But if you really know you have an insect, a grub issue, then you can go out, treat for that, get that additional expert advice if you need it. The other one we'll see sometimes, not as often up here, is chinch bugs, which we'll only see in St. Augustine grass. And they're going to cause damage that looks sort of like drought damage sometimes. A lot of times we will see it near sidewalks and driveways. These insects are visible, but they're hard to spot, and you have to know what you're looking for. So a lot of times I'll get people that look at this and think it's disease. They go buy a fungicide, put the fungicide out. Fungicide's not going to do anything if you have a chinch bug issue. So it all comes down to really taking time to identify what you're dealing with and getting good advice on how to proceed so we don't use anything we don't need to use. That's what I got.